The night my son told me to leave my own house didn't start with anger, it started with silence. I was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a worn-out blanket, sipping cold coffee and staring at a TV screen that was already off. The house was quiet in that familiar way it gets after years of living alone, no footsteps, no voices, no disturbances. It felt safe until the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor made my chest tighten. Daniel walked in. He didn't greet me, he didn't smile, he didn't sit down, he simply stood there like a shadow I hadn't noticed before and reached for the remote. He pressed a button and the TV turned off. That single click echoed louder than any shouting match we'd ever had. Then he spoke, calmly, as if he were informing me of the weather, not giving me an ultimatum. "Mom," he said, "this isn't working anymore. You're going to need to find somewhere else to stay." I didn't flinch, I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I only nodded, because I already knew something he didn't. Before we go any further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. This story isn't about yelling or revenge. It's about patience, timing, and understanding that silence can be the most powerful response when people underestimate you. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 58 years old, widowed, and I have lived in that house for over 32 years. Every corner of this home carries memories, birthdays, anniversaries, quiet evenings, laughter, and tears. It is a home I built with my husband, Robert, and every brick, every nail, every floorboard tells a story. After Robert passed away unexpectedly, this house became my anchor. For 6 years, it was just me. Quiet mornings, predictable evenings, the occasional visit from friends, and the comfort of knowing that this space belonged to me. Then Daniel called. His marriage had ended. He sounded broken, lost, and in need of a place to land. He asked if he could stay temporarily. I didn't hesitate, mothers rarely do. Daniel moved in with a suitcase at first, then a few boxes. Months passed, and soon Rachel entered our lives. She was confident, charming, and she didn't just visit, she moved in. At first, she was polite, asking questions, smiling, trying to be careful. But little by little, she began to act like she owned the place. A chair moved here, a cabinet opened there. My things were placed where I didn't recognize them. My routines, my small comforts slowly dismantled without my consent. Daniel, who had once been protective, remained silent. I began to watch, to observe, to stay calm, because when people feel entitled, they reveal their true nature if you let them talk long enough. Days passed. Mail was opened, keys went missing, personal items shifted. Rachel referred to the house as ours. Daniel stopped defending me, and then that night the TV went off. The click told me everything I needed to know before Daniel even spoke. He informed me I had 1 week to leave. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't yell, because decades of experience had taught me that people reveal their intentions when they believe they've already won. I smiled quietly to myself. Somewhere in the drawers upstairs, hidden safely for years, were the documents Daniel and Rachel had no knowledge of: the deed, trust papers, mortgage statements, everything proving this house belonged to me. That night, I went to bed knowing that their confidence was about to meet reality. And even though they believed they had all the power, they were blind to what was coming. They didn't know patience can be a weapon. They didn't know silence can be terrifying. They didn't know that I was not going anywhere, not without letting them realize their mistake first. And so I stayed quiet, letting the storm they thought they controlled build around them while I calmly waited for the right moment. Daniel woke up the next morning with a sense of satisfaction he didn't deserve. Rachel was already in the kitchen, humming a tune, rearranging cups in the cabinet as if she had been born to manage the household. They both assumed my silence meant compliance, that I had accepted their timeline without question. I made breakfast quietly. Coffee brewed, toast popped up, eggs sizzling. I served them both without a word. Daniel muttered thanks, Rachel smiled, and they walked away, believing they had won the first battle. By noon, subtle changes started stacking up. My favorite chair was in the corner. The desk where I balanced bills had been moved. My personal notebooks, carefully placed on the shelf, were scattered across the dining table. Rachel's voice was soft but firm. "We're just trying to make things more organized." I nodded politely. Every sentence, every gesture, I observed, because when people are overconfident, they don't see what's coming next. Daniel, busy justifying his actions in hushed tones to Rachel, failed to notice that I was preparing for the next move in silence. Days passed like this. Small intrusions piled up. A door left locked, mail left unopened, items relocated without explanation. Rachel began referring to the house openly as ours, reinforcing the illusion that I was the intruder. One evening, Daniel confronted me, raising his voice slightly for the first time. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be." I looked at him calmly, sitting in the chair they had moved. "I understand," I said softly. My words were quiet, but the weight behind them was heavy. He tried to argue, but I simply listened. Every sentence they uttered only confirmed their miscalculation. They believed their confidence and manipulation could push me out. They had no idea how patient I could be, how carefully I had measured my steps. That night, I retrieved the old files from the locked drawer upstairs. The deed, mortgage papers, trust documents, all proof that the house belonged to me. Every signature, every legal clause, every piece of evidence had been quietly waiting for the right moment to be revealed. I didn't panic, I didn't react, I only prepared. Over the next week, tension filled the house. Every glance, every casual remark, every small arrangement became a chess move. Rachel would leave the room, glance back at me with curiosity as if trying to gauge my next step. Daniel tried to reassert control, making plans, discussing timelines, even researching rental options. But I stayed calm. Every move they made only tightened the net around them. By the 7th day, Daniel's patience began to fray. He stood in the hallway, attempting to assert authority one last time. "Mom, you have to go. We've already looked into everything. This house isn't yours anymore." I smiled slightly, letting the words sink in. Their ignorance had blinded them. The following morning, I made one phone call, not to a friend, not to a relative, to someone trained to handle people who thought they had all the power. That call would change everything. And as I hung up the phone, I knew the storm they had underestimated was about to hit. They had built their confidence on my silence, and soon they would realize just how dangerous patience could be. The next morning, the house felt heavier than usual. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, even the distant bark of a neighbor's dog seemed to echo in the tension that had settled over us. Daniel and Rachel moved about as if nothing had changed, yet I could sense it. Their confidence had begun to falter, even if they didn't realize it yet. Breakfast was quiet. Daniel sipped his coffee and scrolled through his phone, trying to appear busy. Rachel hummed the same tune as yesterday, but the notes were slightly off, almost nervous. They were waiting for a reaction from me, expecting irritation or panic, and I didn't give them either. I poured myself a cup of tea and smiled faintly to myself, knowing patience was already working in my favor. Mid-morning, Rachel decided to confront me indirectly. "Mom," she said casually, "we just want to make sure everything is fair for everyone. Don't you think it's better if you look for another place? It'll be less stressful." I didn't reply immediately. I sipped my tea, keeping my eyes calm and steady. The subtle pressure she tried to apply only strengthened my resolve. She was testing me, seeing if I would crumble. I didn't. Daniel interjected, trying to support her. "Yeah, Mom, we've done the research. We know what we're talking about. This isn't personal." I kept my calm. I nodded slowly as though considering their advice. Every word they spoke, every gesture they made only confirmed their ignorance of the reality. They didn't know I had already arranged for a professional consultation, someone who would verify the truth and legally confirm my rights. By noon, small signs of tension became more noticeable. Rachel dropped a cup she was carrying, forcing Daniel to pick it up nervously. Daniel's hand shook slightly as he reached for the mail. Their overconfidence was cracking. The afternoon passed with strategic silence from my side. I did nothing to provoke them, yet every action they took revealed their desperation. I noticed Daniel pacing in front of the living room window, muttering to himself. Rachel occasionally peeked into my room as if expecting me to leave something behind. In the evening, I took out the carefully filed documents from the drawer once more. I reviewed every page, ensuring everything was in order, making mental notes. Their assumptions of ignorance had blinded them to my preparation. I had all the proof I needed, and I hadn't even begun to use it. Dinner was served in silence. Rachel tried to break the calm with small talk, asking questions about the house, about my plans, anything to make me react emotionally. I answered politely, measured, never giving them the satisfaction of seeing distress. Daniel attempted to argue about logistics, but I simply listened, nodding slowly, letting their words stretch thin with meaninglessness. By bedtime, Daniel's agitation was palpable. He left the lights on in every room, pacing back and forth. Rachel whispered to him constantly, both trying to convince each other that they were still in control. But their uncertainty was growing, their confidence had begun to erode. As I prepared for bed, I smiled faintly. They had believed the house could be taken by volume and confidence alone. They had no idea patience, preparation, and knowledge could be far more dangerous. The stage was set, and they had walked directly into it. The next morning, the air in the house felt different, thicker, heavier, as if even the walls were aware of the unspoken battle brewing inside. Daniel moved about nervously, checking his phone repeatedly, as if expecting an email or a text to validate the confidence he had carried for the past week. Rachel was more restless than ever, fidgeting with her hair, rearranging things that didn't need to be moved, trying desperately to assert control over a house that had never belonged to her. Breakfast was a careful ritual. Daniel avoided my gaze while Rachel spoke in an overly cheerful tone, asking mundane questions, almost as if trying to normalize the tension. I responded politely, keeping my voice calm, measured. Every word I spoke was deliberate, designed to maintain composure while letting them realize the fragility of their assumptions. They expected irritation, fear, perhaps even panic, but they received none. By mid-morning, the subtle cracks in their confidence became more pronounced. Daniel misfiled some papers, Rachel knocked over a glass that shattered on the counter. They flinched, glanced at me as if silently asking for guidance, and in that moment I knew they were beginning to recognize their misjudgment. I went about my routine, making a cup of tea, checking some documents I had placed carefully on the desk. Every small task reinforced normalcy while strategically allowing them to overestimate their influence. Daniel tried to engage me in a discussion about moving logistics, about potential apartments, but I only listened, nodding gently, allowing him to exhaust himself in justifications. By afternoon, their tension was palpable. Rachel whispered constantly, throwing sideways glances. Daniel's movements were jerky, controlled, yet clearly anxious. Their belief that confidence could replace knowledge was starting to crumble. And all the while, I maintained my quiet vigilance, observing, measuring, letting patience work its silent magic. Later in the day, Rachel decided to attempt a confrontation. "Mom, you don't really want to make this difficult for everyone, do you? Maybe it's better if you start thinking about your options now," she said, her voice slightly higher pitched than usual. I looked at her calmly, letting the weight of my gaze speak louder than any words. Daniel added, almost pleading, "Mom, we're just trying to do what's best for everyone." I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said softly, the simple words carrying far more power than they could imagine. Their expressions faltered. They had expected resistance, fear, anything to bend me to their will, but instead I remained steadfast. Evening approached, and I revisited the locked drawer upstairs, reviewing every document, the deed, trust papers, mortgage statements, signatures. Every piece of evidence they had ignored or assumed irrelevant was perfectly in order, waiting for the right moment to assert the truth. They believed confidence equaled power, but knowledge and preparation were far stronger weapons. Dinner was served quietly. Rachel attempted small talk, trying to draw a reaction, but I maintained composure. Daniel's tension was visible. He kept adjusting his posture, shifting his weight from foot to foot, muttering softly. Every action they took only confirmed their misunderstanding of the situation. By nightfall, Daniel and Rachel were visibly exhausted. They had invested so much energy trying to dominate, trying to push me out, and they had received nothing but measured calm. That calm was more disarming than any argument, more powerful than any confrontation. As I prepared for bed, I knew the next day would be pivotal. I had already made the necessary arrangements for professional verification of my rights. The trap had been set silently, strategically. Their confidence had blinded them to the reality of the situation. And so, as I lay down, I smiled faintly. They had thought they were in control. They had no idea how close they were to discovering just how mistaken they were. The morning came with a cold, sharp clarity that I could feel as soon as I opened my eyes. Daniel and Rachel were already moving about the house, a nervous energy radiating from every small action. Daniel checked his phone repeatedly, eyes darting to the clock, as if counting down to some invisible deadline he assumed would work in his favor. Rachel moved like a whirlwind, straightening things that didn't need straightening, fumbling with items she had already misplaced twice, all in a desperate attempt to maintain control over a situation that was slipping away. I poured myself a cup of tea and moved quietly through the kitchen, allowing them to continue in their illusion of authority. Every small action I took was deliberate yet unobtrusive, a calm presence in a house brimming with false confidence. They believed that confidence alone could intimidate me, that my quiet demeanor meant weakness. By mid-morning, subtle signs of tension were more pronounced. Daniel's movements were jittery. He dropped a piece of paper while shuffling mail, his frustration barely masked. Rachel spoke in clipped sentences, overcompensating with overly cheerful tones, and constantly checked in with Daniel as if seeking approval. I observed everything, noting the cracks in their composure. Around noon, Daniel approached me, attempting to assert control once more. "Mom, you really need to consider your options. We've looked into everything." "You can't stay here." I remained calm, measured. "I understand," I said, my voice even, unshaken. His words, intended to pressure me, instead highlighted their overconfidence. Every attempt to provoke a reaction failed, and the frustration on their faces grew. In the afternoon, I reviewed the documents I had carefully stored for years: the deed, trust papers, mortgage statements, everything that validated my ownership. They had overlooked these crucial facts, blinded by their arrogance and haste. I made mental notes, preparing for the inevitable moment when their assumptions would be challenged legally. By evening, Rachel's nerves were fraying. She fumbled with the dinner preparations, knocking over a glass that shattered on the counter. Daniel tried to calm her, his voice slightly raised, revealing the strain he had been holding in check for days. Their combined tension was almost palpable, a stark contrast to my quiet composure. As night fell, I moved about the house with deliberate care. Every glance, every measured step reinforced my presence. They were confident, yet increasingly anxious, unaware that the first strategic move had already been set in motion. I went to bed that night knowing the following day would change everything. Their confidence was built on assumptions and silence, and they had not anticipated the force of patience, preparation, and the law working quietly behind the scenes. The following morning arrived with a crispness that made the tension in the house almost tangible. Daniel was up early, moving about with exaggerated purpose, checking the clock, double-checking emails as if he could force the day to go according to his plans. Rachel hovered behind him, adjusting things, nervously glancing my way, clearly trying to read my reaction. Neither of them spoke to me directly, but their every action screamed control, and yet I could see the cracks. I quietly prepared my breakfast, keeping my movements calm and deliberate. They watched, trying to interpret every small gesture as either hesitation or weakness. I smiled faintly to myself, knowing that patience had a strength they were beginning to underestimate. By late morning, their nerves were starting to show. Daniel fumbled with the mail, dropped an envelope, and Rachel muttered under her breath in frustration. I continued with my routine, observing every detail. Every error, every misstep on their part was a subtle confirmation that they had misjudged the situation. Daniel approached me around midday, trying to appear authoritative. "Mom, we've really thought this through. You should just start planning to move," he said, his tone sharp, meant to intimidate. I looked at him calmly, letting a slow smile play on my lips. "I understand," I said softly. No argument, no confrontation, just quiet assurance that nothing they said could unbalance me. Their confidence wavered for the first time, even if they didn't realize it yet. The afternoon dragged on with a series of small confrontations. Rachel tried casual conversations to lure me into a debate. Daniel attempted to corner me with facts about rental listings and logistics. I listened politely, nodding when necessary, allowing them to expend energy while I remained in control through silence. By evening, tension in the house had reached a visible peak. Daniel muttered under his breath. Rachel's movements were erratic, and they both seemed on edge. The calm I maintained only highlighted their growing unease. Every attempt they made to dominate the environment backfired, revealing their own insecurities. Later that night, I retrieved the carefully filed documents from the upstairs drawer once more. The deed, the trust papers, mortgage statements, every single piece of evidence was accounted for. They had assumed their control would be unchallenged, but the truth was quietly waiting, ready to be revealed. As I settled in for the night, I felt a quiet satisfaction. They believed they had power, but all the while the first moves of the real battle were already in motion. Patience, preparation, and the law were aligned in my favor, and soon they would see how wrong they had been. The next morning, the house felt different. Even the sunlight seemed sharper, casting shadows in corners that had gone unnoticed before. Daniel moved with a restless energy, pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath. Rachel hovered close, adjusting things constantly, checking my reactions with every glance. Their confidence, which had seemed unshakable, was beginning to falter. Breakfast was silent. Daniel avoided my eyes, and Rachel's words were clipped, her overly cheerful tone barely masking anxiety. They were waiting for a reaction, hoping I would show frustration, fear, or impatience. I gave them none. Every sip of tea, every careful movement was a reminder that I was calm, composed, and observing. By mid-morning, the cracks in their composure became more evident. Daniel knocked over a stack of papers while searching for his phone. Rachel flinched as she dropped a dish, her hand shaking slightly as she picked it up. Each misstep exposed their growing unease. Around noon, Daniel approached me, attempting once again to assert authority. "Mom, seriously, you need to start planning. We've done the research. This house isn't yours anymore." I looked at him calmly. "I understand," I said softly, letting the words hang in the air. No argument, no reaction beyond that simple acknowledgement. Their expectation of fear or confrontation was met with quiet strength, and it was unraveling them from the inside. The afternoon continued with subtle manipulations. Rachel tried to engage me in conversation, steering topics toward moving, responsibilities, and fairness, but I answered politely without giving away any sign of emotion. Daniel tried to corner me with logistical arguments and casual threats, but each attempt fell flat, revealing the weakness behind their overconfidence. By evening, both Daniel and Rachel were visibly worn down. Their attempts to dominate the space, to pressure me into leaving, had failed. I moved about the house with deliberate ease, reinforcing my presence without confrontation. They had built their confidence on assumptions and overestimation, and now their anxiety was mounting. That night, I revisited the locked drawer upstairs. The documents, the deed, trust papers, mortgage statements were all intact. I reviewed them one more time, ensuring everything was in perfect order. The trap had been set in silence, patiently, strategically. As I prepared for bed, I smiled faintly. The house was mine. The confidence of Daniel and Rachel had blinded them to reality, and the first real confrontation, when it came, would leave them stunned. The following morning, a strange tension hung in the air. Daniel was unusually quiet, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, checking his phone repeatedly and muttering under his breath. Rachel hovered nearby, adjusting things constantly, fidgeting with objects that had already been arranged multiple times. They were trying to assert control, but their movements were stiff, anxious, as if they sensed something shifting beneath the surface. I moved through the house calmly, brewing tea, preparing breakfast, and speaking only when necessary. Every motion, every glance I offered was measured, quiet, and deliberate. They believed confidence alone could intimidate me, but patience and preparation are far more powerful than arrogance. By mid-morning, the tension in the house had escalated. Daniel dropped a letter from the mail, muttering to himself. Rachel flinched as she carried a cup across the room, spilling a few drops. Their nerves were fraying, and their efforts to maintain a facade of control were failing. Around noon, Daniel approached me, trying to reassert authority. "Mom, you really should consider your options. We've done the research. This house isn't yours anymore." I looked at him calmly, a faint smile on my lips. "I understand," I said softly. The simplicity of my response did more to disarm them than any argument could have. Their assumption that I would panic, that I would argue, was crumbling. Throughout the afternoon, subtle confrontations continued. Rachel attempted to engage me in conversations about moving, responsibilities, and fairness. Daniel tried to corner me with logistics and casual threats. Each attempt only highlighted their own insecurities and overconfidence, while my calm presence reinforced my control over the situation. By evening, their frustration was evident. Daniel muttered under his breath, pacing and checking windows, while Rachel's movements grew increasingly erratic. Their belief that they could dominate and intimidate me had completely backfired. That night, I reviewed the documents in the locked drawer once again, the deed, trust papers, and mortgage statements, ensuring everything was in order. The strategy I had built in silence was ready to take effect. As I went to bed, I knew the following day would bring the first direct confrontation. Their misplaced confidence had set the stage, and soon the first real cracks in their control would appear. The morning arrived with a tension that seemed to press against every wall of the house. Daniel and Rachel moved about nervously, each step betraying the cracks in their once confident facade. Daniel checked his phone constantly, eyes darting to the clock, while Rachel adjusted things that had already been arranged multiple times, fidgeting in an almost desperate attempt to assert control. They were beginning to realize that their confidence alone was not enough. I went about my morning quietly, making tea, preparing breakfast, and moving through the house with calm purpose. Every glance, every gesture, every word was deliberate. They expected agitation, panic, or frustration, but I offered none. I remained steady, observant, and patient. By late morning, subtle signs of unease became impossible to ignore. Daniel dropped a stack of papers, muttered under his breath, and fumbled with the mail. Rachel's hands trembled as she carried a cup, and she muttered excuses for every minor mistake. Their composure, which had seemed so unshakable just a few days ago, was beginning to crumble. Around midday, Daniel attempted another direct confrontation. "Mom, this is serious. We've already looked into everything. You can't stay here. You need to move." I looked at him calmly, letting my presence speak louder than words. "I understand," I said softly. There was no argument, no panic, only quiet assurance. Their expectation of fear or resistance had failed, and the frustration on their faces grew. Throughout the afternoon, Rachel tried indirect confrontations, steering conversations toward moving, responsibility, and fairness. Daniel attempted to corner me with logistics and casual threats, but every action revealed their overconfidence and growing insecurity. I remained composed, letting their energy dissipate against the wall of my calm. By evening, the strain on them was evident. Daniel's pacing was jittery, his muttering constant. Rachel's movements were erratic, her attempts to assert control increasingly desperate. Their belief that they could dominate me with boldness alone had backfired, leaving them exhausted and anxious. That night, I revisited the locked drawer upstairs. The deed, trust papers, mortgage statements, all were intact, meticulously organized, ready to be revealed at the right moment. Their arrogance had blinded them to the fact that knowledge, preparation, and patience far outweigh confidence and intimidation. As I lay down for the night, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The trap was set. The next day would bring the first undeniable signs that their control was slipping. Daniel and Rachel had no idea that the first direct confrontation, when it came, would leave them shocked and unprepared. The next morning, the air in the house was thick with tension. Daniel and Rachel moved about like people walking on thin ice, every step careful, every glance anxious. Their confidence, which had carried them for days, was now visibly cracking. They believed they had control, but they were about to discover how quickly that illusion could crumble. I remained calm, moving through the house with deliberate ease. Breakfast was quiet, with Daniel muttering under his breath and Rachel fidgeting nervously. They tried to assert authority, trying once again to convince themselves that I would respond with fear or frustration, but I remained steady. Their overconfidence had blinded them to the patience and preparation I had quietly put into place. By mid-morning, Daniel tried to push the matter further. "Mom, you have to start packing. This house isn't yours anymore. We've done the research." I looked at him calmly, letting my gaze hold more weight than any words. "I understand," I replied softly. That single, quiet acknowledgement unraveled the tension in their mind even further. They expected confrontation, they expected panic. Instead, they got composure, and that was far more disarming. Later that afternoon, I made my move. I called the legal professional I had consulted in advance, scheduling a meeting to formally confirm my rights. Within hours, an official notice was prepared to address the situation. The moment of reckoning was coming, and Daniel and Rachel were completely unaware. By evening, their agitation was obvious. Daniel's movements were erratic, pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath. Rachel's hands trembled as she tried to maintain order, adjusting furniture repeatedly, failing to hide the fear that had taken root. Their belief that confidence and manipulation alone could control the situation had completely failed. That night, I reviewed the documents one last time: the deed, trust papers, mortgage statements. Every piece of evidence was in order, every detail accounted for. Their arrogance had blinded them to the truth, and soon the law would confirm it. The following morning, Daniel and Rachel received the notice. Their faces drained of color as they read the official documentation. Their control was gone. Every smug assumption, every attempt to intimidate, evaporated in the face of undeniable proof. They had underestimated me, and their overconfidence had led them straight into a trap they didn't even know existed. I remained calm throughout, observing their reactions, letting the law speak where words had failed. My patience, preparation, and quiet strategy had worked. The house remained mine, and justice, both legal and moral, was finally affirmed. If you've ever been underestimated or felt powerless in a situation where others believed they had all the control, remember this. Patience, preparation, and knowing your rights can turn the tables completely. Like this video and subscribe if you want to hear more real-life stories of calm, strategic victories that prove silence and patience are sometimes the most powerful tools of all.